Hallo zusammen. Pascal hier von Neutrality Studies.
Hello everyone, Pascal here from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm speaking with military historian Dr. Lothar Schröter. Born in the GDR, Dr. Schröter worked from 1974 to 1990 at the Military History Institute in Potsdam, and most recently held the rank of major in a colonel's position in the National People's Army, as well as serving as head of the Department for Military History of NATO and the Federal Republic of Germany. Last year, Dr. B. Schröter published the book, The Ukraine War, The Roots, the Actors, and the Role of NATO. Today, we want to talk about his East German perspective on the war. Dr. Schröter, welcome.
Herr Dr. Schröter, willkommen.
I'm also glad that I can give this interview. Maybe I can show you the book sometime too.
Glad.
Here it is. The book is also attracting great interest, even though it is largely ignored by the mainstream media in Germany and elsewhere.
Why is it being ignored? And what are your main theses that you would like to present to us?
Well, it's probably being ignored because it doesn't fit the prevailing narrative. That means a counterposition is being established here, one that I, as a scientist, can also support, and it's simply not compatible with the mainstream. The main theses in the book are twofold. The first is that this war in Ukraine is a proxy war of the West against Russia. I substantiated that with a roadmap developed by none other than Zbigniew Brzezinski, among others. This roadmap can be found in his books and in his journal articles in Foreign Affairs. I condensed it. It essentially boils down to this. The main line of confrontation runs between what calls itself the value-based West and the People's Republic of China. If we want to win this confrontation, we have to defeat Russia. And if we want to defeat Russia, we have to have Ukraine. That's almost word for word what Brzezinski wrote. It's not just my own thesis, it's also shared by others, for example by four-star General Harold Kuyat, who is well known to most people. And he says the same thing, and some others go even further. So that's the main thesis, that this is a proxy war, ultimately about a new world order. Will it truly become multipolar, genuinely multipolar, or will it fall back into a unipolarity led by the West under the leadership of the United States? That's the main thesis. The second thesis is that this war in Ukraine did not begin on February 24, 2022. The war in Ukraine began on the night of April 6 to 7, 2014, when one of the leaders of the Maidan coup announced, "We will launch an anti-terror operation." This referred to an operation against the Donbas regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. In fact, this anti-terror operation began on April 13, 2014, and I'll say it openly, with an assault by Ukrainian nationalists, openly supported by fascist forces on the two Donbas regions. This assault marks the beginning of the war in Ukraine. What happened on February 24, 2022, was the entry of the Russian Federation into a war that had already been ongoing since 2014.
Können Sie das weiter ausbauen?
Can you expand on that a bit more? As a military historian, it's very helpful when you can pinpoint the exact dates on which military force was used. The precursor to the war, which you also describe in your book, is this whole build-up to 2014. What are the key points that you would say are essential to understanding how we got politically to the Maidan, and then from the Maidan to this so-called anti-terror operation, where the violence really began to spiral out of control?
In der die Gewalt wirklich dann anfing aus dem Ruder zu laufen.
In the West, people were fully aware of Ukraine's significance. The importance of this large country for the confrontation with Russia, and ultimately also with the People's Republic of China, was clear from the outset. That's why the first coup was organized, the so-called Orange Revolution in 2005 under the leadership of Yulia Tymoshenko. However, this Orange Revolution did not yet succeed, and Ukraine entered relatively calm political waters. And of course, the West observed that as well.
Und dies hat natürlich der Westen auch beobachtet. Es gab eine Äquidistanz der Ukraine.
There was an equal distance maintained by Ukraine toward both Russia and the West, toward the EU and NATO. And of course, the West didn't like that, so it organized this second coup, the Maidan coup, from November 2013 until around the end of February 2014. This Maidan coup, as we all know, was supported by the West, not only through the $5 billion from Ms. Nuland as Deputy Secretary of State, but also through other measures, appearances by Western politicians, including the then German foreign minister in Kyiv. So it was supported, and this coup ultimately succeeded.
Und dieser Putsch klappte dann tatsächlich. Also Ende Februar war dieser Putsch gelaufen.
So, by the end of February, that coup was over. The nationalist forces, partly massively supported and promoted by fascist groups, then succeeded. And then this so-called anti-terror operation began, as I mentioned. This anti-terror operation, meaning nothing other than the military campaign of the nationalists in Ukraine against the Donbas regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, did not produce the military results that had been hoped for. In other words, this offensive stalled. However, over time, it had already claimed quite a number of lives. Estimates speak of 15,000, of which 75% were civilians, and of those, again, 75% were in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions.
In den Gebieten Donetsk und Luhansk. Also diese Offensive, diese militärische Offensive der
So, this offensive, this military offensive by the Ukrainians, did not go as they had planned. And the result of that was that they wanted to gain time. They gained this time through the Minsk negotiations, with Minsk I and Minsk II. We know today from various sources, and your listeners and viewers know this too, that this was only meant to buy time. Not only Ms. Merkel and Mr. Hollande confirmed this, but also then President Poroshenko, who spoke plainly about it in an interview with Corriere della Sera in Italy.
Mit Corriere della Sera in Italien Klartext geredet hat. Es ging nur darum, die ukrainische Streitkräfte auf NATO.
It was only about bringing the Ukrainian armed forces up to NATO standards. That is, first, increasing their personnel, training them, bringing them up to NATO standards, and equipping them with comprehensive Western military technology. And that is exactly what happened. Admittedly, there was then a force of 140,000 to 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers. They were already stationed in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and they were also positioned east of the Crimean Peninsula. East of the Crimean Peninsula, that meant the Russian Federation had to expect that a military advance might take place, bringing the entire coast of the Sea of Azov under Ukrainian control.
In ukrainischen Besitz brachte. Das hätte nicht nur bedeutet, den Verlust der Gebiete.
That would not only have meant the loss of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, but also the loss of Crimea, and that would have meant defeat in the war. The loss of Crimea, in turn, would have meant that one of the four strategic groupings of the Russian naval forces would have been lost, namely the Black Sea Fleet. Ultimately, this would have led to the result that the Black Sea would have become NATO's Mare Nostrum. A great power like Russia could never have allowed that. The Americans didn't allow it in 1962 either, when the USSR stationed medium-range missiles in Cuba. As we all know, I can't go into detail now, even under the threat of nuclear war, the Americans did not allow it.
Und Russland konnte dies auch nicht zulassen. Das heißt,
and Russia could not allow this either. That means the Black Sea would have become NATO's Mare Nostrum. Then the military events continued to unfold after the obvious failure of Minsk I and Minsk II. It cost countless lives, not only military personnel, but above all, civilians. And of course, the Russian Federation saw that as well. The Russian Federation observed what was happening there. General Kujak, whom I already mentioned, also reported that this force had advanced to the Sea of Azov. The Russian Federation, of course, observed that too. And in December 2021, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs summoned the U.S. ambassador, and during that meeting they developed a program for him.
Gegenüber diesem Botschafter ein Programm entwickelt. Dieses Programm lief im Wesentlichen darauf hinaus, im Buch ist das.
And this program essentially came down to, it's described in much more detail in the book, let's develop a security system from Vladivostok to Lisbon and from Lisbon to Vladivostok. That was the first main idea. And the second, which was already a demand often misunderstood in the West as an ultimatum, was make sure your Ukrainian protégés withdraw from the line of contact, that is, from the front line. The U.S. ambassador initially received this message, and then, in January 2022, he appeared at the Russian Foreign Ministry and said, to put it somewhat laconically, no, we won't do that. And at that point, the Russians knew what time it was.
Und da wussten die Russen, was die Stunde geschlagen hat. Da wussten die Russen, was die Stunde geschlagen hat.
That's when the Russians knew what time it was. And in that context, Russian tanks with the Z on their hulls appeared at the Ukrainian borders. That was the situation. And then the military escalation continued, also confirmed by the OSCE. In February, massive attacks by Ukrainian artillery began on the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And Russia could only interpret that as meaning that an attack was imminent. There are documents which I still need to examine very carefully, so they are not yet confirmed. Until then, I won't use them. I only know that, according to Russian sources, there are documents indicating that another massive attack by Ukrainian forces was supposed to begin on March 8, 2022.
Am 8. März 2022 beginnen sollte. Aber nochmal, da bin ich ganz, ganz vorsichtig.
But again, I'm being very, very cautious here. As long as I don't see any definitive documents on this, I'm not getting on that horse. And then it was like this. As I said, the Russians saw what was going to happen there. And then, before February 24th, the Russians did something they hadn't done for 8 years. They actually wanted the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk to remain within the Ukrainian state. Back in 2014, we voted against the referendums organized by the newly established People's Republics. And we said, don't hold this referendum. We in Moscow don't want that. You should stay with Ukraine, of course, with the granting of appropriate rights, such as the use of the Russian language. But then, shortly before February 24th, the Russians recognized these people's republics. And when you recognize states, you can also conclude treaties with them. Whether others like it or not, even secessions are possible, against the will of the so-called mother country. That's what the people's republics did. So Russia recognized these people's republics as states. When you recognize states, you can conclude treaties. That's what they did, namely, a treaty of mutual assistance. And on the basis of this treaty under international law, which was also reported by Moscow to the UN, the Russian Federation, let me put it deliberately this way, entered the war on February 24th, 2022.
Ich formuliere bewusst, in den Krieg eingetreten. Bis dahin vielleicht mal.
That is also the entire basis in international law that Russia keeps referring to, and that the West keeps ignoring. But there is a logical line in international law. Whether one wants to recognize it or not is another question, but it exists. And that is why Russia also says, we are merely exercising the right to collective self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter.
Exactly. As I said, one can argue about it. There are also opinions, for example, that the separation of territories is not possible, that it is contrary to international law. That opinion exists. I have a different view on that. I have also supported it with UN resolutions. In the book, it's all in there, with reference numbers, that separations are possible when the rights of population groups are permanently and significantly violated. And now I have to raise the question, was that the case in Donetsk and Luhansk, where autonomy rights were not granted and the right to use one's own mother tongue, namely Russian, was abolished?
The point
is also that Russia keeps saying, NATO recognizes this right as well, because that's the right Kosovo made use of to break away from Serbia, and NATO recognizes it. And Germany, the Federal Republic, does too. But that already brings us back to hypocrisy, to this application of double standards. What I'd be very interested to know is, how do you, as a military historian who studied NATO even before the 1990s, but from the outside, a German military historian studying NATO from the outside, not from within, how do you see the historical thread from the 1970s and 1980s up to the 2020s?
Von den 70er, 80er Jahren bis jetzt in die 2020er hinein.
Da darf ich mir erlauben, auf zwei Bände.
Allow me to refer to 2 volumes of one of my own books. Excuse me? Here it is, NATO in the Cold War. It's about 200 pages. I wrote these 2 volumes for NATO's 60th anniversary in 2009. It's a timeline that includes an introduction for each period. The main point made in these books was and still is, NATO was not founded as a defensive alliance, but as an anti-Soviet alliance, a military pact against the USSR. At that time, there was no corresponding alliance on the eastern side. It was only established in 1955 with the Warsaw Defense Pact, an anti-Soviet military alliance that included the Federal Republic of Germany.
Antisowjetisches Militärbündnis unter Einbeziehung der Bundesrepublik Deutschland. Wir haben heute den 70. Jahr.
Today marks the 70th anniversary of the Bundeswehr. There was a strong desire to include the Bundeswehr in NATO for various reasons. First, as a battering ram, and of course also by incorporating cadres from the Wehrmacht and, incidentally, from the Waffen-SS. Even officers up to the rank of lieutenant colonel from the Waffen-SS were hired there, as long as no war crimes were involved. They had experience on the Eastern Front, and they were then integrated and played a key role in the creation of the Bundeswehr, which ultimately had a strength of 495,000 active soldiers and 1.3 million reservists. So that means NATO was always an anti-Soviet alliance and is today an anti-Russian alliance.
Und ist heute ein anti-russisches Bündnis, vor allen Dingen jetzt zunehmend mit weltweit.
Above all now, increasingly with global ambitions also toward the People's Republic of China. And I'll say it quite openly, on fundamental issues, the North Atlantic Alliance, to put it mildly, has always told untruths. And the biggest lie was the one about the threat from the East. It never existed. There has never been a threat from the East. If the Russians had really intended to take over Western Europe, they would have marched to the Atlantic in 1945. They didn't do that, and it has always been, as I said, an anti-Soviet, anti-Russian alliance. And unfortunately, nothing has changed to this day about that lie of a threat, the lie of the threat from the East.
Not only has nothing changed, it keeps being dressed up in new clothes. For example, in the Ukraine war, the most important piece of information is actually that between 2014 and 2022, Russia did not want to annex the Donbas regions, but explicitly said, stay in Ukraine, with the whole idea being that if that's the case, and Ukraine is a federal state, then its neutrality is secured. Then it's a buffer state. And this buffer state status is something that not only Russia has always wanted, but also the Soviet Union. That was even the plan for Germany.
1952-1953, that was the starting line from March 1952. How did it come about?
How is it that the West simply doesn't want us to have a stable, balanced Europe that coexists with the Soviet Union and Russia?
Das hängt ganz einfach damit zusammen, dass
That's simply because at the time it was in the West's interest to defeat the USSR. That breakthrough came in 1991, and today the goal is to break up Russia. Every year there are 1 or 2 conferences that deal with the dismemberment, the filleting of the Russian Federation. It's about the enormous resources, especially the raw material resources of the Russian Federation. There's a Bertelsmann study that lists in detail the vast deposits of natural resources located particularly in Ukraine. And notably, former German military officers speak quite openly about how without the lithium deposits in Ukraine, the entire electric mobility sector, for example, would be impossible.
die ganze Elektromobilität beispielsweise man vergessen könne. Es geht die Zerschlagung Russlands, es geht die Ausschaltung
It's
eines
about the
großen
dismantling of Russia,
Landes
about
und es
eliminating
geht
this country as a great power,
die Voraussetzung
and about
dafür,
creating the conditions to
dass Russland
ultimately
nicht
be able to
am Ende
deal
der
successfully with the
Kontinent
People's
sind. Und
Republic of China.
wollen sie keinen
And that's
Krieg.
why
Deswegen
they don't want peace.
betreiben sie eine
That's why they are
Eskalation
pursuing
von
escalation from one level to the next.
und
And that's
deswegen
why they keep inventing new versions of threat scenarios. It's complete nonsense to claim that the Russian Federation wants to attack NATO around 2029. There is absolutely no political basis for that, and no military one either.
militärisch auch nicht.
General Kujat has made that perfectly clear. It is militarily complete nonsense to say that NATO is to be attacked with the forces of the Russian Federation.
Föderation solle die NATO angegriffen werden. Das ist militärisch völliger Unsinn. Das
That's
ist
complete military nonsense. So, purely from a military standpoint, it's total nonsense, not just politically completely wrong. And by the way, I always say this jokingly in lectures I give. What would they even want in Germany? Do they want broken infrastructure? Do they want a railway system that doesn't work? Do they want a slowly declining and clearly struggling economy? Do they want this moral decay we're experiencing in Germany? Not only in Germany, but also in other Western countries. Do the Russians want all that? Do they want a destroyed country that they'd have to rebuild afterward? What do they actually want? NATO, of course, doesn't answer that question, only with propaganda, really.
Eigentlich nur mit Propaganda.
Wie erklären Sie sich den
How do you explain Harold Kujat, who, as a West German, eventually became the military chief of NATO in the 1990s? Yes, in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And that we had this period in the 1990s when there were indeed plans for a partnership for peace, meaning the integration of Russia. Do you see here a side of NATO, or a side of the Europeans, that wanted to work on this peace project, but was ultimately defeated? Or how do you explain Mr. Kujat?
Wie erklären Sie sich den Herrn Kujat?
Ja, ich hätte in meinem ganzen Leben nie gedacht.
Yes, I would never have thought in my entire life that I would one day pay the highest respect to an Inspector General of the Bundeswehr, and thus to the highest-ranking soldier of the army opposite me. That I would one day pay my highest respect to the top officer of NATO, and that's what one is as chairman of the military committee, so not a Western general. I would never have believed myself capable of that in my whole life. It's just that General Kujat is an exceptional figure among the German general staff.
Erscheinung ist unter der deutschen Generalität. General Kujat hat offensichtlich das, was Friedrich Schiller
General Kujat clearly embodies what Friedrich Schiller once expressed in the Ode to Joy, later set to music by Beethoven. That is courage before thrones. This quality is obviously lacking in the German general staff, clearly lacking in the German officer corps. We tried it once more on July 20th, 1944, after they had realized that the Eastern Campaign would not work. General Kujat demonstrates that courage before thrones, and I have the highest respect for him because of it. Everything else one hears from the German general staff makes me shudder.
von der deutschen Generalität hört, bringt mich zum Schaudern.
Es ist einfach, es gibt Leute, die haben
There are people who still talk today about the opportunity, the missed opportunity. Although, depending on how you interpret it, one has to say it wasn't lost, it was deliberately thrown away, that agreement. And that includes Americans as well, such as Jack Matlock, Ambassador Jack Matlock, who keeps saying, even now at 95 years old, no, we didn't win the Cold War. We ended it together with the Soviet Union because it was in our mutual interest. And then, the Soviet Union collapsed, connected, but for other reasons. We should have used that opportunity to build a common European home for everyone, and security structures. That also includes others, and these are truly key figures in the history of the Cold War. How do you see this connection? That these people weren't the ones who won, but that it was the others, that it was the Brzezinskis of this world.
nicht gewonnen haben, sondern dass es die anderen waren, dass es die Brzezinskis der Welt waren.
Naja, ganz einfach, weil die Brzezinskis...
Well, quite simply, because the Brzezinskis and others, Kissinger in the end as well, Friedman, for example, were always the ones who embodied the main forces of American industrial and financial capital. This industrial and financial capital was always expansionist, always aggressive, and in the end they prevailed, just as incidentally in Germany as well. Friedrich Merz is in government, but he is not in power. Those in power are entirely different people. And this is a revival, at least in part, of the typical German imperialism we've known since the late 19th century. They prevailed, and in Russia they also had a partner, namely the Yeltsin administration. In the 1990s, Russia was politically, militarily, and economically completely on its knees. That was the reason. A partner in Moscow, namely Yeltsin. And that was also the basis for the partnership that was granted at the time. But only later, at the turn of the millennium, when another president came along who appeared before the Bundestag in September 2001, that period was over. In the Bundestag, he essentially said two things. He said, let's build a security system, from Lisbon to Vladivostok, and from Vladivostok to Lisbon. And he said something that he didn't state outright, but that was clearly readable between the lines. Ladies and gentlemen, the mild Yeltsin years are over. And with that, the confrontation that had been initiated from the other side had now become mutual.
But he received a standing ovation for it. The parliamentarians stood up and applauded, because Vladimir Putin also spoke in German. It's hard to put into words how much that meant, considering that his family, I believe, was stationed in Leningrad, and that some of them also died during the blockade. And he sought this rapprochement with Germany as well. And that rapprochement, unless I'm interpreting it wrong, not only didn't come about, but where things stand today, it's not just in pieces, it's in...
This rapprochement was always desired by the Russian Federation under Putin, but it was not desired by the other side. It was never desired by the other side, because the old goal remained, to break up Russia, to carve it up. That is the old goal that, as I know, goes back to Rohrbach, who during the First World War developed his Rohrbach theory, according to which Ukraine would be a central element in the dismemberment of Russia. That was not what the West wanted. And those applauding in the Bundestag in September 2001, they did not recognize what was between the lines in Putin's words. And if they did recognize it, they did not believe it. Only, they went ahead and did it. Well, it would have been best for Germany if we had remembered the course of the old Bismarck. In my book, I included various quotes from the Chancellor. He was a reactionary like no other, no question, but he was a realistic thinker. And he, to put it briefly, summed up his Russia policy under the heading, "We can afford to make enemies of everyone, just not Russia. Just not Russia." As I said, different times. Russia is still where it was in Bismarck's day. Russia is still a great power, just as it was then in the concert of European powers. We should have remembered that lesson from German history, if that is, other goals had not been pursued.
But it seems that the credo guiding German politics at the moment is third time's the charm. Because since Bismarck, it's already been tried twice. Do you think it's being tried again now? No, you've already said it. It's being tried again. But where is the limit? Because right now we can see it doesn't seem to be working again.
Well, it's not going to work either. So if there were to be a third world war, exactly what the arch-reactionary Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev jointly declared at the end of the 1980s would happen. A nuclear war cannot be fought and cannot be won. It must never be waged because it would lead to the end of human civilization. Those were their statements back then. Nothing about that has changed. People in the West know that too. My thesis is, the West doesn't want a third world war either. They don't want it because they know they would burn in it themselves. What they are doing, however, is maintaining a balance on the brink of war. a very dangerous balance on the brink of war. And as a military person, you know that conflicts can also develop in such a way that they gain their own momentum. And that momentum can lead to a situation that can no longer be contained. And that is dangerous.
Ja.
Yes, that's the whole fear behind it. That we've now created a situation here that can be hijacked by relatively small groups of people, because it's easy to stage a false flag or something similar, and then the different sides come under pressure to act. And that we currently don't really have any de-escalation mechanisms anymore. Although, since the Russians and the Americans have started talking again, there might still be a chance for a phone call. How do you see it?
Für ein Telefonat. Wie sehen Sie das?
Well, these false flag operations can, of course, occur. And within NATO, there are indeed different forces, special ones like Hungary or Slovakia, and probably soon also the Czech Republic. And then there are the hardliners, who are based in the Baltic states and in Poland. Now, according to Russian media, on Russia Today, a false flag operation was allegedly planned and then foiled. A MiG-31 fighter bomber, armed with a Kinzhal missile, was supposedly to be hijacked to Romania, and this bomber was then supposed to be shot down. It was said to have been prevented. Well, I only ever believe that once the verifiable facts are on the table. But of course, such fake operations are carried out constantly. Think of the drone overflights. It's always blamed on the Russians. They should shoot a few down and then see what happens. They should go ahead and do that. And then it's always said, yes, everything points to Russia, everything points to Russia. Well, that's the danger. From such false flag operations, that escalation mechanisms develop which can no longer be contained. That's really the danger. And that's why it's urgently necessary to de-escalate. And that's exactly what the German government is not doing right now, unlike what one must credit Willy Brandt for in the West. Walter Scheel, who was foreign minister at the time, or even Erich Honecker, was a fighter for peace. There's no doubt about that. Leonid Brezhnev was one too. The Afghanistan intervention, which he himself opposed, doesn't contradict that. No, people have abandoned the idea of resolving conflicts peacefully. They have turned away from détente and taken the opposite course, escalation.
Können wir noch ein bisschen auf Ihre Erfahrungen auch in der DDR?
Can we draw a bit more on your experiences in the GDR? The disappearance of the GDR, or its absorption into the FRG. I've always thought it was a mistake to call it a reunification. It was actually not an annexation, but the absorption of the GDR into the FRG. Do you feel that this process of the 1990s also has something to do with where Germany stands today in relation to Russia?
Well, in any case, the second German state has disappeared, the one that always acted as a brake against those in West Germany who pushed for confrontation. That state is gone, and I would add, it was in any case the German peace state. And you're absolutely right, it wasn't a reunification, because that would mean reuniting, perhaps at the level of 1950. Then one could have spoken of a reunification. I think, to put it neutrally, it was a union of the two German states. And there are many people who actually speak of a hostile takeover by the West. There's hardly anything left of it. From the GDR, and if so, it was found under terms like medical care center for polyclinics, because that's exactly what today's medical care centers are. Nothing was carried over. On the contrary, everything was dismantled, come hell or high water. Let me give just one example. In the GDR, 95% of all social scientists, we were called social science scholars back then, were dismissed. 95% were removed from universities and colleges. Such a purge never occurred either in the Soviet occupation zone or the GDR, nor in the West after the collapse of Hitler's fascism. Such a purge has never happened. And of course, people don't forget that. More and more people are realizing that this was not really about reunification, but about an annexation, a takeover.
Einen Anschluss, eine Annexion, neutral vielleicht ausgedrückt noch einmal, eine Vereinigung.
Perhaps put neutrally, another unification, but nothing more than that. And that's why people are now increasingly realizing, certainly also in my own family circle, that we didn't actually learn so many wrong things in school about capitalism and imperialism. People are turning away, and that is often denounced as turning away from democracy. No, it's not a turning away from democracy. It's a turning away from the system. People are slowly beginning to question the system itself, turning away from the propaganda. In my circle, even in my vacation home that I rent out, when people are asked, "Don't you watch the news anymore?" they answer, "No, we don't watch the news anymore. We don't watch talk shows anymore. We're tired of being lied to all the time."
Is that feeling present in East Germany right now? That is, would you say it's not just you as a military historian, but a good part of the population who are suddenly realizing that they've been misled?
Yes, the terrible thing about it is this. Deep down, people are asking themselves the fundamental question about the system, without admitting it to themselves. But they sense that the system is wrong. The system is wrong. How did we end up here? And they say, something fundamental has to change here. Something fundamental has to change here. And then they make a strategic mistake. They vote for the AfD. And that's why the former territory of the GDR is now colored blue. They want something to change fundamentally. The majority of AfD voters are not fascists, not neo-fascists, and not even right-wing extremists. The majority of voters are saying something fundamental in this country has to change, no matter what. And then they make this strategic mistake. Unfortunately, I see that in my own family circle as well. That's really the point.
How, this relationship at the moment? I keep asking myself, in which direction can it still go? By the way, I share the assessment that NATO, all in all, does not want a third world war. We've learned that over the past 3.5 years. NATO could have intervened at any time, but it didn't, and it doesn't want to. It wants to wage a proxy war. That was the strategy. Mr. Zelensky also had to be brought back into line again and again. For example, when he said that a Russian missile had struck Poland, he had to be put back on a short leash very quickly. And the idea that in Ukraine, so, to the last Ukrainian, they keep fighting, I think that idea is still there. But if we now take that into account and say, yes, the strategy should be to maintain this grey zone and maneuver around the war. Russia isn't stupid. We know from the Russians, also from Russian colleagues, that they analyze it exactly that way. What's your assessment of how the Russians are trying to counter that, realizing that at least the Germans and the Europeans are not willing to deviate from this boundary? What do you see happening there at the moment?
I think now we also need to try to characterize the nature of Russian warfare. I'm regularly accused of lacking empathy and judgment when I say the following. Russian warfare is designed to cause as few civilian casualties as possible and as few of their own military casualties as possible. That's why they're waging a war that could be described as a war of attrition. And here comes the accusation of lack of empathy. They are essentially letting Ukraine bleed out. And then I add this thought. If the Russian armed forces were waging the war in Ukraine the way the Red Army had to fight against the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS, then this war might have long since been over on the battlefield. I just want to remind you, of the 27 million victims among the Soviet peoples, the Red Army alone had 11.7 million dead. 11.7 million. Now let's subtract the 3.5 million who the Nazis let die as prisoners of war. That still leaves us with a good 8 million. The Wehrmacht, which had been at war since 1939, had 4 million dead.
Im Kriegsstand hatte 4 Millionen Tote. Das heißt, die Rote Armee ist nach vorn gestürmt.
That means the Red Army charged forward and was also sent forward, if you know what I mean, no matter the cost. And that's something the Russian leadership isn't doing today. By the way, almost every war is decided on the home front, and from two perspectives. How strong is the support among my population? At the beginning of the second phase of the war in Ukraine, on February 24, 2022, about 75% of Ukrainians and 75% of Russians supported their political leadership and thus also the conduct of the war. In Russia, that hasn't changed much. The numbers today are around 75 to 78%. In Ukraine, support is crumbling.
Das ist der eine Punkt.
That's one reason why most wars are decided in the hinterland. The second point is the economic and military economic potential. The Russian arms industry is running at full speed. Of course, that can't leave the overall economic system unaffected, but the Russian economy seems able to handle it, and it is being equipped with the most modern military technology, some of which is beyond what the West can achieve. Ukraine, on the other hand, depends largely on Western arms deliveries, and if those either stop coming or can no longer be paid for by the EU, by Europe, one can imagine that this military economic support would fall away, and then the war would be decided there as well.
I just want to add one more thing, because a colleague, Andrei Martyanov, made this observation, and I think it's important. From the Russian side, this is not considered a war, but a special military operation. And Mr. Martyanov says that this has an impact on what kinds of force are used and what tactics are applied. If it were a war, then a different manual could be in use. I share your views. This war of attrition is designed, quite simply, to disarm Ukraine, including its entire military, while conserving its own human resources as much as possible, which is of course still extremely martial. What's frustrating is that in the West, the public perception being fostered is actually a completely different universe. That's why people who don't share our historical assessment of this war don't understand the framing at all. To them, it looks like an excuse for the war from the Russian side.
Well, you mentioned that term, military special operation, and linked it to the way Russia conducts warfare. I wouldn't do that. In my view, the term military special operation is based on other considerations. For decades, wars have no longer been formally declared, even though that would actually be required under the Hague Convention of 1907. One is supposed to declare a war. I also explained in detail in my book why that term was chosen. Because it has implications under international law. It has implications under international law that I can't go into detail about here for reasons of time. It's all in my book. No, the nature of Russian warfare results from the two things I mentioned. First, the Ukrainian armed forces are to be worn down, as terrible as that sounds. And second, their own losses, and losses among the Ukrainian civilian population, are to be avoided as much as possible. These are the key starting points for why Russian warfare is the way it is.
I share that assessment. Otherwise, you only have to look at the difference in civilian casualties between the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza to see how differently one can fight when pursuing different goals. What do you think? We've now talked quite generally about the whole issue and also about the historical course of events. Was there anything we haven't yet discussed that you think is important to mention or explain?
Naja, es geht immer die Frage des Waffenstillstandes.
Well, it's always about the question of a ceasefire and why the Russian Federation won't agree to it. The Russian Federation can't agree to it because a ceasefire would immediately mean that NATO troops would be stationed on Ukrainian territory. And if that were the case, the Russian Federation would basically have to attack and eliminate those NATO troops, and that would mean the outbreak of World War III. So one has to ask for understanding that Russia can never, under any circumstances, agree to such an unconditional ceasefire.
Dem bedingungslosen Waffenstillstand nie und nimmer zustimmen kann, sondern die russischen Forderungen müssen erfüllt werden. Neutralität.
Rather, the Russian demands must be met. Neutrality of Ukraine, no accession to NATO, no stationing of NATO forces of any kind on Ukrainian territory, and then also demilitarization. Well, perhaps the Russians might still be willing to negotiate about that. But also denazification, what is happening there in Ukraine in terms of fascist tendencies, is unbelievable, and the German political leadership remains silent about it. There, as we all know, fascist traditions are actually being revived. SS divisions, Galicia, and others. One cannot name everything.
Man kann nicht alles benennen. Ich habe ein Beispiel gebracht.
I gave an example, how the former mayor of Potsdam, an SPD member, traveled to Ivano-Frankivsk and fraternized with fascists there. I say that very clearly. There's a subchapter about it in my book. As an anti-fascist who became conscious of that identity in the GDR, I was raised that way and consciously embraced it. I am ashamed that the German government does not call out this fascistization in Ukraine, and is not even capable of saying that there is no longer even a bourgeois democracy there. There is no opposition, and people remain silent about it. That angers me deeply.
Yes, that frustrates all of us who try to go through the world with open eyes. But somehow, unfortunately, we can't get out of that situation right now. However, your book is an important step and a valuable reference in this very sad story. For people who want to buy the book, I'll direct them to your publisher's website. Is there anywhere else where people can find you or your writings?
Well, I'm a board member of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Brandenburg. Some of my publications can be found there. I'd like to point out once again, especially today on the 70th anniversary of the Bundeswehr, that my postdoctoral thesis, together with 3 others, was already published in 1989. Military History of the FRG from its beginnings to the present. It's probably only available secondhand now. I also referred to the 2-volume work NATO in the Cold War, 1,200 pages. And I'm currently preparing a publication, a small book, on something that has been completely overlooked. Since April 1st of this year, just to note, the Bundeswehr has established a Homeland Security Division. This Homeland Defense Division has nothing to do with folklore, but has 2 tasks. First, ensuring operational freedom for NATO forces at the front, and second, and this is something no one has on their radar, deployment against the internal enemy. According to Article 87A, Paragraph 4 of the Basic Law, which is the emergency constitution that was accompanied by numerous emergency laws back in 1968. So this Homeland Defense Division also trains for deployment against the internal enemy, in case the Federal Police, formerly the Federal Border Guard, and the State Riot Police are not sufficient. As I said, you can look it up, Article 87A, Paragraph 4 of the Basic Law. There have recently been 2 exercises where this was practiced. One took place in Hamburg. There, military equipment was to be transported to the Eastern Front as part of the exercise, and dock workers refused to do it. In the exercise scenario, the Homeland Security troops then took action against those workers. So, hardly anyone is aware of this. I've already written 2 articles about it in the magazine Hintergrund. You can also read them online. And it's supposed to become a small book at some point.
Bitte schicken Sie mir das.
Please send it to me once it exists or comes together. Then we can discuss it again, because you are absolutely right. This is an issue that poses a direct danger, and we should be aware of it.
Ja, natürlich, klar, auf jeden Fall. Und es hat
Yes, of course, absolutely. And there were 5 or 6 major popular movements in the Federal Republic. For example, one called Without Us, which opposed the establishment of the Bundeswehr. But there was also a very large one in this context, State of Emergency of Democracy, at the end of the 1960s. That means that throughout the 1960s, the broadest segments of the population in the Federal Republic resisted the looming emergency constitution, which was then enacted in May 1968, as well as the individual smaller emergency laws. There was a federal minister of the Interior who said these were the so-called drawer laws, and those who had seen these drawer laws, which remain secret to this day, turned pale. Some of it is accessible. That's the Employment Assurance Act. That means as soon as it's decided that it will be enacted in a state of tension, the state of tension has to be declared. People can be required to work, companies can be required to hand over their trucks, and so on. Those are the emergency laws. Hardly anyone is aware of them, and when I give lectures about it, people look at me in shock. That exists? I can't imagine that. And since 1989-1990, I've stopped saying I can't imagine something. I've learned that anything is possible. Since 1989-1990.
We will have a second or even a third conversation about this. Thank you very much for these insights, which, to be honest, I didn't know about either. Dr. Schröter, thank you very much for your time today.
I thank you and your listeners and viewers. All the best. Above all, peace.